By August of 1862, the country had been at war for over 15 months. During this time, Vermont sent thousands to the cause, many of whom came home severely wounded, crippled, or dead. Despite this, the drive to raise 5,000 additional troops began immediately.
After the initial call for 300,000 troops in the summer of 1862, Vermont felt that it was going to get a respite from recruiting duties. But when Lincoln issued his subsequent call for 9-month men, Vermont pitched into it with fervor, and the towns readily supplied the troops needed to fill those regiments of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th.
The main purpose was to preserve the Union, and that was extremely strong. And of course, in the early days, men fell over one another to enlist.
For many young men of Vermont, despite the risk, the choice was clear.
My conviction was to volunteer and join Uncle Sam's great army and fight for the right freedom. My young wife held me back, for said she, "You will never return alive, and I cannot let you go." It was indeed hard to leave wife and home and friends, believing it quite probable that I should never see them again. The battles up to the time I enlisted were all against the Union Army, and many thousands had been killed and wounded, and thousands more had died in hospitals, and surely the prospect of returning was doubtful. And yet my country called, and patriotic devotion said volunteer and help save the life of the government then struggling for existence. Sergeant Charles E. Shepard, 13th Vermont.
I was just 19 when Fort Sumter fell, and my young manhood was aroused and at once began to think, read, and consider what I ought to do. I was young and knew nothing about the requirements of a soldier. After the Battle of First Bull Run and the success of the rebel army, I began to see that serious war was at hand and many would be needed to save the Union from destruction. I was proud that I was a soldier and glad to do all I could to help put down the rebellion. Samuel W. Benjamin.
President Abraham Lincoln, concerned over public reaction to this call-up of additional troops, received support from his friend, Vermont Governor Frederick Holbrook. Holbrook had encouraged the call for additional troops and even lobbied governors of other loyal states.
President Lincoln had to raise 300,000 more troops from the loyal states, and it was through enthusiastic support of governors like Governor Holbrook of Vermont that his task was made much easier, because the governors took it upon themselves to ensure that their states met their quotas.
The Republican governors, I think, were vital to Lincoln. They encouraged him in raising more troops, rather than the other way around, which I think maybe even today would be the reverse. The federal government would be pressuring the states, and it seemed to be the other way around, especially I think in New England, and certainly in Holbrook's case.
In Vermont, Lincoln not only received support from the governor, but the backing of the people.
As soon as the war cloud appeared above Fort Sumter, I was uneasy and began to wish that I could be a soldier. Everybody was up in arms about the wicked and foolish conduct of the rebels trying to succeed and break up the Union. My father and all of our neighbors were outspoken for President Lincoln and stood strong for him in the course he had adopted and favored war rather than surrendered principle. John Kimball Cross.
Vermont towns quickly filled their quotas. To entice enlistment, many towns offered bounties up to several $100s. Support for the troops was strong in the state. In Whitingham, townspeople voted to pay a bounty of $100 and exceeded their quota. To not support the war effort was a very unpopular position, as one citizen learned. At the end of the meeting, John Corkins proposed the following resolution.
Resolved that John Gates, by voting against paying any bounty or making any appropriation to aid volunteers who enlist in the service of the United States, has forfeited all claim to the right of citizenship to the town of Whitingham and ought to be transported to Haystack Mountain, where he could enjoy his selfless propensities unmolested.
The motion passed unanimously.
village was a hotbed of patriotism. Everyone who in any way showed sympathy for the South was made to run up the American flag, and some who found they were looked upon with suspicion as to their loyalty moved out of state. Mrs. Levi Fuller, Brattleboro, Vermont.
In Swanton, 20-year-old Stephen F. Brown had been eager to enlist when the war first began. However, his father also wanted to serve, and his mother would not allow both of them to be gone. After drawing straws, Stephen stayed behind to manage the farm. Within 30 days after his father's return, young Stephen enlisted in the 13th Vermont Regiment. There was 40-year-old Freeman Sunderland of Highgate, who brought his 16-year-old son George, both enlisting in the 13th Vermont. Within 1 month of the firing on Fort Sumter, Francis Voltaire Randall of Northfield, a descendant of Revolutionary War hero Seth Warner, enlisted in the 2nd Vermont. He fought at the First Battle of Bull Run and during the Peninsula Campaign. In 1862, after attaining the rank of colonel, he returned to Vermont to command the 13th Vermont Regiment. His son Charles, aged 16, also enlisted in the 13th Regiment. His father promoted him to second lieutenant, possibly making him the youngest commissioned officer in the Union Army. Randall's youngest son, Francis Jr., aged 12, known as Jimmy, ran away from home and followed his father's regiment to Virginia, where upon arrival he said, "Here I am, Dad." Jimmy signed on as a drummer boy and served to the end of the war. Captain John Lonergan was born in Ireland in 1839 and came to America with his family in 1848 to escape the potato famine.
In 1861, when the 2nd Vermont Brigade is being organized, John Lonergan from Winooski, an Irishman, formed a company of Winooski Irishmen, and they were in the 2nd Vermont Regiment. Well, they went through their training in Burlington, and when the regiment was to be mustered into federal service, that morning his entire company is AWOL, drunk. So they call Lonergan on the carpet, and they say, "Lonergan, you've got 24 hours to get all your men here sober so they can be mustered into federal service." So the next day, all of his men are there. They muster them into federal service, and they ship out with the 2nd Vermont for Washington. Well, they get down in Washington, and apparently they continued to be a problem, to the point where the War Department finally discharged the entire company, officers, captain, the whole lot of them, back to Vermont. They said, "We don't need you."
Lonergan was furious and protested vigorously.
So for a year he pesters the War Department and the governor unmercifully to give him another command. Finally, Lincoln's call for 300,000 more troops comes up in the summer of '62. Lonergan is allowed to raise another company. He raises a company.
Known as a fighter, he was always getting in trouble during his military career. But his protest eventually worked to his advantage. He became commander of Company A of the 13th Vermont Regiment, which was made up primarily of Irish Americans, including Lonergan's best friend and fellow Irishman, Lieutenant John Sinnott. In Burlington, George Benedict enlisted as a private in Company C of the 12th Vermont Regiment. Benedict was from a prominent Vermont family. His father owned the state's largest newspaper, the Burlington Free Press. Prior to enlisting, Benedict had written several pro-war editorials. Later, he was appointed aide-de-camp to General George Stannard with the rank of second lieutenant. The 2nd Vermont Brigade was comprised of 5 regiments, each having 10 companies of approximately 100 men each. Total brigade strength was about 5,000 men. Companies were usually formed within a town or group of towns. For example, Company F of the 16th Vermont Regiment had soldiers from the town of Dover, Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax. Among those were Chandler M. Russell of Wilmington, a 19-year-old teacher who had just entered the Westland Academy in Wilbraham, Massachusetts. Within days of the call for volunteers, he left and returned to Wilmington to enlist. There was 22-year-old Dana Pitt Chandler, a third-generation Vermonter, his grandfather having settled the wilderness between Brattleboro and Wilmington. And 19-year-old Danford Jacob Whiting of Wilmington was listed in the town records as a farmer. And 23-year-old Siren B. Lawton, who worked as a clerk in this store and later became lieutenant in Company F. These 4 young men, who were friends and neighbors, knew the potential dangers of this venture. Wilmington had already lost many of its sons to war and lost many more before its end. Upon leaving for service, 2 of these men looked upon their town for the last time, for they did not survive the war.